The book fell from his hands the moment Catherine Keller stepped through the tree line, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved. She had come to confront a beast. Every soul in Harlan Creek had told her the same thing, that Noah Shepard was feral, dangerous, a man who had retreated so far into the mountains of Colorado that civilization had worn clean off him like paint off a barn in a hard rain. They said he growled at strangers. They said he had once driven off a circuit preacher with nothing but a look. They said the last man who climbed the trail to his cabin had come back pale as birch bark and refused to speak about what he had seen. And now here was Catherine, 32 miles from town, her horse lathered and trembling at the tree line behind her, staring at a man who sat on a flat granite boulder beside a mountain creek with a leather-bound volume of poetry open across his knee. He was reading Walt Whitman. She knew the cover because her father had owned the same edition of Leaves of Grass, and the sight of it in those large, rough hands sent something crashing sideways inside her chest that she could not immediately name or afford. For one terrible, clarifying second, every warning she had been given dissolved like sugar in water, and the thing that replaced it was far more frightening than anything the people of Harlan Creek had described. Then Noah Shepard looked up, and his dark eyes found hers with a directness that felt less like seeing and more like being read. "You are on private land," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had not needed to compete with crowds in a long time. Catherine's chin went up by a full inch, the way it always did when she was afraid and refused to show it. "I know exactly where I am, Mr. Shepard. I came here on purpose." He did not stand. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against the rock beside him. He simply closed the book with a deliberate care that told her the pages inside mattered to him, and he studied her the way a man studies weather coming in over a ridge. "Most people don't," he said. "Come here on purpose, I mean." And that was how it began, not with the violence or the savagery or the dark secret she had been half-braced for. It began with a book of poetry, a mountain creek running cold and clear over smooth stones, and a silence between two people that was already full of things neither of them was ready to say. But to understand why Catherine Keller had ridden 32 miles into the Colorado Rockies on a November morning in 1879, you had to go back 6 weeks. To the evening, she stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek with 2 leather trunks, a medical bag, and the particular posture of a woman who has traveled very far from what she knew and is determined not to let anyone see how much that costs her. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a man named Ellsworth Prout who sold flour and gossip in equal measure, a livery operated by a young Mexican man called Domingo, who was the most competent person Catherine would meet in her first month in town, a saloon with a painted sign missing the letter A, so it read the Golden Nugget SLOON, 2 churches that disagreed violently about salvation, and a small attached surgery that the town's previous doctor had abandoned when his wife decided she preferred Denver. The surgery was the reason Catherine was here. She had answered an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper that had called for a physician willing to serve a frontier community, and she had told herself that the word frontier was an invitation rather than a warning. She had her medical degree from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, an institution that had required her to fight for every single piece of knowledge she now carried, and she had her father's stubbornness and her mother's practical intelligence, and she had decided that those 3 things ought to be enough for Colorado. What she had not expected was that Harlan Creek would greet her arrival with something close to bewilderment. "You're the new doctor," said Ellsworth Prout, not quite phrasing it as a question but not quite as a statement either. It landed somewhere in the uncertain middle, like a bird that cannot decide which branch to land on. "I am," Catherine said. "Catherine Keller, MD. I'll need directions to the surgery and somewhere to stable my horse overnight." Prout had looked her over in a way she was well accustomed to, cataloging her dark hair, her composed expression, her medical bag, her clearly feminine frame, and conducting some internal calculation whose result displeased him without quite giving him enough grounds to argue. "Domingo will handle the horse," Prout said finally. "As for the surgery, it's beside the church on the left, not the Baptist one, the other one." "Thank you," Catherine said, and she moved before he could think of anything else to say. She had spent her first 2 weeks establishing herself with the kind of methodical patience she had learned was required of her. She was thorough. She was competent. She kept her fees fair and her records meticulous. She treated a broken arm on a ranch hand named Davis Coffee, a severe case of bronchitis in old Mrs. Abernathy, who thereafter became her most devoted advocate, and a small boy named Eli Prout, who was Ellsworth's youngest son, and who had gotten a fishhook through the webbing of his left hand in a way that made Ellsworth pale and look at the ceiling while Catherine removed it with careful, steady hands. After Eli, Ellsworth Prout became cautiously cooperative. After Mrs. Abernathy began telling everyone at the Baptist church that Dr. Keller had given her back her breathing, Catherine started receiving patients who had previously been treating themselves with mail-order tonics of highly questionable composition. She was building something real. She could feel it. Something that had a foundation. And she had almost begun to believe that Harlan Creek might become the thing she had needed it to be, a place where she could matter, when the situation with the mountain changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October when a rancher named Gerald Fitch came into her surgery with his left arm wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, and a story that arrived in fragments because he was holding himself very still against the pain. Fitch ran a cattle operation on the eastern slope below the tree line, which meant his northern boundary touched land that belonged, technically and actually, to Noah Shepard. The two men had been engaged in a dispute over water rights for 2 years, a fact that every person in Harlan Creek seemed to know and have opinions about. The wound on Fitch's arm was a deep laceration from a fence wire that had snapped back against him, and Catherine cleaned it and closed it with careful sutures while Fitch, relieved by the laudanum she had given him for the pain, told her about his neighbor with the particular free-flowing candor of a man whose inhibitions had temporarily packed up and left. "Shepard is dangerous," Fitch told her, watching the ceiling with half-closed eyes. "I don't mean ordinary difficult. I mean the man has gone wrong up there. Lived alone so long he's forgotten how people are supposed to behave. Sheriff Dowd went up there last spring about the water dispute and came back saying Shepard met him at the property line with a rifle and told him in language I won't repeat in a lady's presence that the next man who came on his land uninvited would regret it," Catherine said, which was not agreement but which Fitch took as encouragement. "Before he went up there he was in the war," Fitch continued. "Came home broken, people say. His family had some kind of trouble. Nobody knows the whole story. He sold his father's farm in Pueblo and just went up, built a cabin, won't come down. Sometimes you see smoke from his chimney in winter and you think, well, at least he's still alive. But he's not right, doctor. Whatever he was before, he's not right anymore." Catherine finished the last suture and tied it off. "He'll need to stay off this arm," she said. "The wound is clean, but if he tears the stitches, he risks infection." Fitch had blinked at her. "Did you hear what I was telling you?" "I heard every word," Catherine said pleasantly, "and I'll treat Mr. Shepard exactly as I'd treat any other patient if the occasion arises. Now rest that arm." She had not thought much more about Noah Shepard that day or the day after. She had enough to occupy her, a town that needed her, a surgery that needed organizing, a particular problem with Ellsworth Prout's cousin Beaumont who had arrived from Missouri, and immediately decided that Catherine's presence in Harlan Creek was either an affront to nature or a romantic opportunity, and he was unclear on which. But then, 2.5 weeks later, a boy came running to her surgery door at 6 in the morning. He was perhaps 11 years old and she did not know him. He had clearly been running hard, his chest was heaving and his face was red despite the cold, and the moment she opened the door he said, all in one breath, "Are you the lady doctor? There's a man hurt bad up on Shepherd's Mountain and Domingo said you were the only one who would go." Catherine looked at him steadily. "What man? Who is hurt?" "A trapper named Rue," the boy said. "He camps sometimes in the valley below Shepard's land. He came down this morning to the livery bleeding from his side. He said he fell on his own knife in the dark. Domingo says he won't make it to Denver, and the surgery here is too small for what he needs," and the boy gulped air. "And Domingo says you'll know what to do." He was right that she would know what to do, and he was right that Domingo had good judgment about her. She had the boy take a message to Domingo, and she packed her surgical kit and she went. And by 8 o'clock that morning, she had the trapper named Rue on the table in her surgery, and was working on a pneumothorax that would have killed him by noon if left alone. Rue survived. He was a gnarled, weathered man of about 50 who smelled of wood smoke and pine, and who wept without self-consciousness when he woke to find himself still breathing, which Catherine found rather moving. He stayed in her surgery for 9 days. On the 3rd day, he started talking. Rue was not a man given to long speeches, but he was grateful, and gratitude tends to loosen even taciturn tongues. He told her about the mountains, about his trapping roots, about the valley he favored in late autumn, and he told her about Noah Shepard. His account was different from Gerald Fitch's. "I know the man," Rue said, his voice still rough from the pain but his eyes clear. "Not well, he doesn't let anyone know him well. But I've crossed his land a few times over the years, and he's never once turned me away when the weather was bad. Winter of '77, I would have frozen in that valley if he hadn't come out to find me in the storm. Brought me inside, fed me, got me warm. Never asked for anything. Never talked much either, but he was decent, is what I'm saying. Whatever people in this town tell you about him, he is a decent man." "What about the rifle?" Catherine asked, because she was thorough and she liked complete information. "I've heard he meets people at his property line with a rifle." Rue was quiet for a moment. "He had a family," he said finally. "Wife and a little girl. About 6, 7 years ago. Something happened to them. I don't know the whole story, and what I do know isn't mine to tell. After that, he went to the mountain and he stopped letting people close. The rifle isn't because he's uncivilized, doctor. It's because he's been hurt bad enough that he doesn't trust anyone not to hurt him again. There's a difference." Catherine had sat with that for several days, turning it over the way you turn a stone in a creek to see what lives underneath. She had come west partly because she understood about being told you were not what the world needed. The woman's medical college had trained her excellently, but the world outside it had spent the subsequent years sending her the clear message that a female physician was an anomaly to be tolerated at best and a provocation at worst. She had built walls of professional composure around herself that were as solid as anything Noah Shepard had ever constructed on his mountain, and she was self-aware enough to know it. She did not think about him romantically. That would have been absurd, she told herself. She thought about him the way she thought about any patient she had not yet examined, with clinical curiosity, and with a professional's instinct that the reported diagnosis might be incomplete. Then, in the first week of November, a child came to her surgery with a hand injury. The child's name was Thomas Alcott, and he was 8 years old and belonged to a family that ran sheep on the western slope. He had gotten his right hand caught in a fence trap of the sort that was laid for predators, and the damage was significant. 2 fingers badly crushed, the kind of injury that, if not treated properly, would cost him the use of those fingers for life. Catherine treated him. She worked for 2 hours with the careful, painstaking attention she gave every patient, and she saved the function of both fingers, though there would be scars. Thomas Alcott's mother wept. Thomas Alcott himself was very brave and only cried twice, and Catherine let him keep the suture needle after she'd finished with it, which seemed to console him greatly. But that was not why Thomas Alcott mattered to this story. What mattered was that Thomas Alcott told her, while she was working, that his family had been having trouble with a predator, a mountain lion that had come down and taken 2 sheep in as many weeks. His father had set traps, but the traps had not worked, and they were frightened, because mountain lions that came down to farms were hungry mountain lions, and hungry mountain lions were unpredictable. "Mr. Shepard comes down sometimes when the lions get bad," Thomas told her, with the casual authority of a child sharing local knowledge. "He knows where they den. He came to our farm 2 winters ago and walked the fence line and told Papa which sections were weak and where the cat was likely to come through. Papa wanted to pay him, but Mr. Shepard just said to leave him alone after that." Catherine paused in her work. "He came down from his mountain. He does sometimes," Thomas said, "when there's a reason. Mama says he's not actually mean, he's just sorrowful. There's a difference." The echo of Rue's words in a child's mouth made Catherine look up. There's a difference. She had thought about that for 3 days before she made her decision, and the decision, when she made it, was not about Noah Shepard at all. It was about a medical matter that had been troubling her since she arrived. The previous winter, according to Mrs. Abernathy and several other long-term residents, Harlan Creek had lost 4 people to a respiratory illness that had swept through in February. The illness had started up on the mountain, so everyone said, and come down with a trapper who'd passed through. It had killed a young mother named Mary Fitch, who was Gerald Fitch's wife, and an old man and 2 children. The illness sounded to Catherine, from the descriptions she assembled carefully over several weeks, like influenza complicated by secondary pneumonia. It was the kind of illness that was survivable with proper care and aggressive treatment, and the kind that killed people when there was no doctor and no access to the basic interventions that could have saved them. She could not do anything about last winter, but she could do something about this one. The mountain above Harlan Creek had 3 families she knew of, the Alcotts with their sheep, a mining family named Dowd who were distant relations of the sheriff, and whatever household Noah Shepard maintained. If another respiratory illness came through this winter, all of them were isolated enough to be in serious danger. She needed to know whether any of them had underlying conditions, whether they had access to certain basic supplies she could provide, and whether they understood what warning signs to watch for. She rode out to the Alcotts and the Dowds first, over 2 separate days, and that went well. She made notes. She left supplies. She answered questions. And then she looked at her map and looked at the trail north of the Alcott farm, and decided that Rue and Thomas Alcott and Mrs. Abernathy, who had told her that Noah Shepard once helped build the Baptist church during a single long-ago summer before his trouble came, could not all be wrong about the same man. She did not take the rifle story lightly. She thought about it carefully. She decided that a man who knew the difference between people who deserved his trust and people who didn't was not the same as a man who was simply violent, and she decided that she would conduct herself with honest, direct purpose and see what happened. What happened, as she had already told you, was that she came through the tree line and found him reading poetry. After those first few strange seconds of stillness, Noah Shepard stood up, and Catherine realized that Fitch's description of him as a large man had been accurate the way calling the Rockies large hills was accurate, technically true, but comprehensively wrong in its proportions. He was 6 feet and something more, broad through the shoulders in the manner of a man who did real physical work and had done it for years, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were, she now saw up close, an unusual shade of dark gray, like sky before a storm that hasn't decided yet what it wants to do. He was perhaps 34 or 35 years old. He was wearing a heavy wool shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen a great deal of use, and he looked like exactly what he was, a man who lived alone on a mountain, but there was nothing feral or broken in his eyes. There was wariness. There was intelligence. There was something that might, if she had to name it, have been loneliness so habitual it had become invisible to its owner. "You're the new doctor," he said, not a question, so he knew about her. The mountain was isolated, not deaf. "Yes," Catherine said. "My name is Catherine Keller. I'm not here to cause you trouble, and I'm not here about the water dispute, which frankly seems like something you and Mr. Fitch ought to settle between yourselves with a surveyor rather than a lawyer." She paused. "May I come closer? I'd like to talk to you about something medical." He studied her for a long moment. She kept her hands visible and her posture open, and she met his eyes without challenge or apology, simply as a person standing in front of another person. "You came alone," he said. "I did. That's not smart." "Possibly," Catherine agreed. "But I couldn't imagine you'd shoot a doctor who came alone carrying a medical bag and no weapon. That would be a peculiarly poor use of a rifle." Something moved in his expression. It was very brief and very carefully controlled, but it was there, a fractional shift that was not quite amusement, not quite surprise, not quite either. It was something in between that she filed away for later examination. "Come to the cabin," he said. "It's cold." It was cold. She had not let herself feel it while she was riding, but now that she had stopped, the November air was biting with the particular sharp tooth of mountain altitude, and she was grateful for the suggestion. The cabin was perhaps a quarter-mile from the creek, up a gentle slope through stands of aspen whose leaves had long since gone. It was larger than she'd expected, solidly built of hewn logs with a stone chimney that was currently doing excellent work, a covered porch with 2 handmade chairs, and a stack of firewood on the east side that was taller than Catherine herself. Attached to the south side was a small structure that might have been a workshop. Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, a table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves of provisions and books. The books arrested her attention the same way the poetry had arrested it outside. There were more than she would have expected in any frontier dwelling, arranged on shelves with obvious care, not chaotic but not ostentatiously organized either. A bookshelf built into the wall beside the fireplace held what she estimated at perhaps 60 or 70 volumes. There were works of poetry she could see from several spines, and what appeared to be history and something by John Muir, and several titles she could not read from the angle at which she was standing. "Sit," Noah said, gesturing toward one of the 2 chairs at the table. He moved to the stove and she heard the clink of a coffee pot. Catherine sat. She placed her medical bag on the table and opened it, not to take anything out, but because having it open was a signal of purpose that she had found useful in situations requiring the establishment of trust. "I want to explain why I'm here," she said. "I'm listening," he said, and his back was still to her, and she noticed that he moved through the space of his cabin with a particular kind of ease, the ease of a man who knows every inch of the place where he lives. She told him about the previous winter's deaths. She told him what she had pieced together about the illness. She told him that she had already visited the Alcotts and the Dowds and provided them with information and some basic supplies, and that she wanted to do the same for him. She was careful, precise, and completely honest, including about the fact that she had heard about him from multiple sources and had formed her own assessment, which differed from the one most commonly circulated in town. When she finished, Noah Shepard set a tin cup of coffee in front of her and sat in the opposite chair, and he looked at her across the table the way he had looked at her at the creek, with that directness that was like being read. "Fitch told you I was dangerous," he said. "Several people did," Catherine said, with great sincerity. "What did Rue tell you?" She looked up. "You know Rue. He came through in October. He mentioned there was a new doctor in town." A pause. "He said she was clever and stubborn." "That is accurate," Catherine said. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup, grateful for the warmth. "He told me you were a decent man. He also said that whatever happened to your family wasn't his story to tell." The silence that followed that statement was a specific kind of silence. It had weight and texture. Catherine did not try to fill it. "My wife died," Noah said, after a moment that lasted the length of a long breath. 6 years ago. Fever. My daughter was 4. His voice was flat and factual in the way voices get when they have practiced carrying grief so long that the carrying has become structural, load-bearing. "My daughter is alive. She lives with my wife's sister in Pueblo. I see her when I go down for supplies 2 or 3 times a year." Catherine absorbed this carefully. "That must be very difficult," she said, not a platitude, she meant it exactly as stated. "It is what it is," he said, then as if surprising himself. "Her name is Clara, she's 10 now." A pause. "She writes me letters, she's learning to read faster than I taught her." The flash of something unmistakably paternal pride, warm and unguarded for just a second before he caught it and put it back somewhere private, made Catherine's chest do the thing it was not supposed to do when looking at a patient or a subject of professional concern. She redirected herself firmly. "I want to leave you with a list of symptoms to watch for," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "And I have quinine and some basic supplies I'd like you to have. If you develop a fever above a certain threshold or a productive cough with these specific characteristics, I need you to come down to town or send word." "I don't generally come to town," he said. "I know. I'm asking you to make an exception for your own health, not for my convenience." She pulled out the paper she had prepared for all 3 mountain households and slid it across the table. "I wrote it all down. You can refer to this without having to ask anyone." He looked down at the paper. He read it, she could see his eyes moving through the text, and she noticed that he read the way people read when they are genuinely comfortable with reading, not laboring over it. "You write a clear hand," he said. "Thank you. I was taught by an exacting schoolmistress." She began to pack the supplies she had brought for him into an organized pile on the table. "There's also something I want to address that isn't medical, strictly speaking." He looked up. "The people in town are frightened of you," she said. "Not because you have done anything truly terrible to them, as far as I can determine, but because you are unknown, and people tend to construct stories about what they don't know, and the stories tend toward the dramatic. I am not frightened of you, but I am aware that your isolation makes you vulnerable in a different way than they think, not because you're dangerous to them, but because you are alone up here with no one to help you if something goes wrong, and that is a genuine medical and practical concern." He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully categorize. "You're a direct person," he said. "I have found that directness saves time and prevents misunderstanding," Catherine said. "My experience of the alternative is that it generally satisfies no one." "How long have you been in Harlan Creek?" 6 weeks. He looked back at the paper. "And in those 6 weeks, you have decided that I need to be visited by a doctor who rode 32 miles alone because no one else would tell me how to survive a winter respiratory illness." "That is a reasonable summary," Catherine said. "All right," Noah said. And then, very quietly, almost as if he was talking to himself as much as to her, "Whitman talks about that, about people who come to you straight and honest without pretense. He calls it the clear soprano singing at the margins of the crowd." Catherine went very still. He seemed to realize what he had said because he moved slightly, something shifting in his posture, not embarrassment, she thought, but something adjacent to it, the awareness of having been unexpectedly seen. "The poetry," she said. "I recognized the book. My father had the same edition." "What did he do, your father?" "He was a doctor," she said, "in Philadelphia. He was also the person who told me that becoming a physician was not merely possible for me, it was necessary. That particular kind of encouragement shapes a person." "Yes," Noah said simply, "it does." She stayed another hour. She told herself it was to ensure he understood all the medical information she had provided, and that was partially true. But she also found herself in a conversation that kept opening sideways into things she had not expected, not because either of them was trying to make that happen, but because two people who each live largely in their own minds, and who rarely encounter another mind that moves at a similar speed, sometimes find themselves covering a great deal of ground very quickly. He had fought in the war between the states, Union side, as a young man of 17 at the end of it, a fact that explained certain things about his economy with words and his composure under uncertainty. He had come home to his father's farm in Pueblo and worked it for several years and met his wife, a woman named Anna whose people were from Missouri. He had built a life. And then the life had broken, and he had come up here, and he had been rebuilding something ever since, although what exactly he was building was a question he seemed to be still working on. She did not press him on any of it. She offered things from her own life with the same measured honesty she used in everything else, and he received them with a careful attention that she found she had missed without knowing she had been missing it, the experience of speaking to someone who actually listened. When she stood to leave, the afternoon light was already going amber, and she knew she needed to ride hard to make it back to town before dark. "I'll come back," she said. "Not for any specific medical reason, just to check in. This winter is going to be hard." He walked her to the tree line where her horse was waiting, which she had not asked him to do. He stood there while she mounted, and just before she turned the horse he said, "Catherine." She looked back. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Nobody does that." She held his gaze for 1 second longer than she strictly needed to. "You're welcome, Noah," she said, and she used his first name deliberately as an offering, a door left open, a thing that could be walked through or left alone as he chose. She rode back down the mountain into the cold-smelling, familiar noise of Harlan Creek, and she put her horse in Domingo's livery, and she walked back to her surgery, and she stood in the middle of the clean, organized room she had made for herself, and she put her hand over her sternum because her heart was doing something that her medical training could identify perfectly well, and her common sense was telling her to ignore. She ignored it for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, Ellsworth Prout came to her surgery in the late afternoon, with a face full of worry and news that Noah Shepard had been seen in town. This was apparently unusual enough to be considered news. Prout delivered it with the particular energy of a man who considers himself a reliable reporter of local events, and then added that Shepard had come in for supplies at his general store and had been, Prout conceded with evident reluctance, perfectly polite, had paid in cash, and had asked whether the new doctor was available. "He asked for me," Catherine said. "Didn't say why," Prout said. "Just asked if you were available. I told him you were at the surgery and he said he'd find it himself." Noah arrived 20 minutes later. He knocked, which struck her as characteristic. He was a man who understood that property lines applied in both directions. She opened the door and he was standing there with a piece of paper in his hand and his hat held in the other, and he looked slightly less at ease than he had in his own cabin, which she understood perfectly, because the town was not his territory and she suspected it felt that way. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked around the surgery with the same attention he gave everything: the shelves of medicines, the examination table, the desk, the diplomas on the wall which she had hung partly for her own reassurance, and partly because she had found that visible credentials reduced the number of people who asked whether she was sure about her diagnosis. He read the diplomas. She could see him reading them. "You graduated with distinction," he said. "I worked for it," she said simply. He held out the paper. "Clara wrote to me she has a cough. Her aunt says it started 3 days ago. I read your list and the cough matches the 3rd description: productive, worse at night with fever." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the fear of a father at a distance from his child. Catherine took the paper. She read Clara's letter, which was written in the neat, slightly labored cursive of a child still growing into her handwriting, and which did indeed describe symptoms that warranted attention. Then she looked up at Noah's face and made her professional assessment quickly. "If you ride now, you can be in Pueblo by tomorrow evening," she said. "I'll give you a preparation that may help with the cough and the fever, and I'll write instructions for Mrs. What is Clara's aunt's name? Meredith Clare. I'll write instructions for Mrs. Clare. Pueblo has a doctor, Dr. Hoffman, I believe. I'll write him a referral note as well." She was already at her desk writing. "Clara is young and otherwise healthy, which works in her favor. Respiratory illness in children can move fast, so going today is the right choice." She looked up briefly. "You made the right call coming here." "I wasn't sure I would be," he stopped. "Welcome," she said gently. He met her eyes. "Yes. You are always welcome here," Catherine said, and she meant it with the full professional clarity of a physician establishing that her door was open to a patient who needed it, and she also meant it with that other thing, the the thing she was not yet naming, that lived underneath the professional clarity like a second river running below the first. She gave him the preparation and the letters, and she told him what to watch for and what would require escalating to Dr. Hoffman immediately. And she said, when he was at the door, "Send word when you get there. I'll be watching for it." He turned. "I don't have a way to reach you besides coming to town. Ask Domingo at the livery. He'll get a message to me faster than anyone." Noah nodded. Then he said, as if the words were something he had decided to say and was not yet sure about, "When I come back, would it be?" He seemed to restructure the sentence. "Will you come up the mountain again?" "Yes," Catherine said, simply and immediately. Something settled in his expression. Not happiness, not exactly, because it had not got that far yet, but the particular quality of tension that releases when a thing you were afraid was impossible turns out to be possible. "Good," he said, and he left. He was in Pueblo for 9 days. On the third day, word came via a note delivered by a southbound rider who gave it to Domingo, who brought it to Catherine. Clara was responding well. Fever broken. Cough improving. Dr. Hoffman had confirmed a respiratory infection, but not the severe pneumonia Catherine had been most concerned about. Noah wrote in a hand that was spare and clear and said, at the end of the medical report, one additional sentence that Catherine read 4 times. The sentence was, "She asked me who taught me to read the warning signs, and I told her a doctor in Harlan Creek, and she said she wanted to meet the doctor, and I found I did not have a good argument against it." Catherine sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she put the note in the top drawer of her desk where she kept things that mattered. He came back to the mountain 12 days later, and the following week she rode up to see him. This visit was different from the first. The first had been purposeful and professional, with its clear medical framing to steady them both. This one was simply a visit. She brought her medical bag out of habit, but she also brought a book, because she had looked at the volume on his shelf that she had not been able to read before, and had recognized it as Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. And she had her own copy in her trunk that had traveled with her from Philadelphia, and she brought it on a hunch that turned out to be correct. He had made coffee by the time she arrived, as if he had been expecting her at roughly this hour, and they sat at the table in the cabin, while the November wind came down off the high peaks and ran against the log walls, and she asked him what he thought about Bathsheba Everdeen. What followed was 2.5 hours of the best conversation Catherine Keller had had in years, possibly in her adult life. Not because of what they talked about, the novel and poetry, and his opinion of John Muir's recent writings, and her observations about the West versus the East, and his experience of the mountains in different seasons, but because of how they talked. There was no performance in it. There was no navigation around sensitivities or management of impressions. There was just 2 people who had each been somewhat alone in the world and who were finding, with a mixture of surprise and caution and something beginning to feel dangerously like joy, that the other person's company was excellent. He walked her to the tree line again when she left. This time she lingered a few minutes longer before mounting, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, and she said, "Your daughter sounds remarkable based on her letter." "She is," he said. "She gets it from her mother." "And from her father," Catherine said. He looked at her as if she had said something unexpected, though she couldn't see why it would be unexpected for a father to have passed something of himself to his child. "I'd like to bring her here this spring," he said. "When the weather is better. She hasn't seen the mountain in 3 years." "I think she would love it," Catherine said. Then, because honesty had served her well so far, "I would very much like to meet her." He was quiet for a moment, and the silence was the kind that forms around something significant. "She would like you," he said at last, and there was a quality in his voice that she couldn't analyze on the mountain trail in the cold, but that she thought about for the entire ride back to town. The weeks that followed built themselves into something Catherine could only describe afterward as the warmest part of a cold winter. She went up to the mountain once a week, sometimes twice. Noah came down to town on 4 separate occasions over the course of December, which Ellsworth Prout reported to her each time with an expression of careful neutrality that told her he had noticed something and was waiting to see how it developed before deciding what he thought of it. Mrs. Abernathy, who was a sharper observer than Prout, simply smiled at Catherine one morning after the second of these town visits and said, "The mountain man bought fabric from Prout's store last week. Bright blue, not the color a man buys for himself." Catherine said, "Mrs. Abernathy, that is speculation." "It is," Mrs. Abernathy agreed cheerfully, "and I'm very good at it." It was on Noah's third visit to town that Beaumont Prout, who had not given up his conviction that Catherine's presence in Harlan Creek was primarily for his benefit, made the mistake of intercepting Noah on the main street and making a remark that was both threatening and proprietary. The gist being that the doctor was spoken for, and strangers from the mountain should keep their distance. Catherine had been coming out of the general store when this happened, and she heard the tail end of it. She saw Noah look at Beaumont with an absolutely still expression that she had come to recognize as his version of deciding something carefully, and then he said, quietly and without any drama, "The lady is a doctor and a person of considerable independence. I expect she makes her own decisions about who she speaks to." Beaumont, who was several inches shorter than Noah and did not have Noah's particular quality of compressed stillness, went slightly red and said something blustering. Noah said nothing more. He simply looked at him until Beaumont ran out of bluster and left. Then he looked at Catherine, who had been standing on the porch of the general store watching this with her medical bag in one hand and a distinct sense of having witnessed something that had illuminated several things at once. "Thank you," she said, "though I would have handled it." "I know you would have," he said. "I didn't do it because you couldn't. I did it because watching him speak to you that way required a response, and it seemed more productive than the alternative." What was the alternative? Something that was definitely amusement moved through his eyes. Something significantly less measured. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and the sound surprised them both slightly. He looked at her with that expression she had been building a private catalog of the one that was not quite warmth yet but was clearly heading there, the way dawn is not yet light but is already the promise of it. "Have dinner with me," she said. "The hotel does a serviceable meal on Fridays." A pause. "All right," he said. They had dinner at the Harlan Creek Hotel, which was observed by approximately 8 people, who then told approximately all of the rest of the people in town. The meal itself was not significant for anything except that it went on for 3 hours, well past what the waitress apparently considered an appropriate dinner length. And that at the end of it Noah walked Catherine back to her surgery in the dark, and they stood on the porch in the cold for 20 minutes talking about things that were increasingly unnecessary to continue talking about given that the conversation had clearly concluded, and they were both simply standing there in each other's presence because neither of them was quite ready to stop. "I should let you go," he said, finally. "You should," she agreed. Neither of them moved. Then he said, with the particular quiet directness she had come to associate with things he had thought about carefully before saying, "I have not felt this way about another person since Anna. I want you to know I am aware of that, and I am telling you because you deserve honesty." Catherine was very still for a moment. The cold air moved between them, and somewhere down the street the saloon was making its usual Friday night noises, and the moon was up and clear over the mountains, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was physiological and also rather more than that. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I want to be honest with you in return, which means admitting that I am in the habit of treating my own feelings with considerable clinical distance, and that in this case the distance is becoming difficult to maintain, and that this is not something I say lightly or easily." He looked at her for a long moment. "Neither do I," he said. And then, very carefully, he reached out and took her hand, which was bare because she had taken her gloves off earlier and forgotten to put them back on, and his hand was warm despite the cold in the way of hands that belong to a body working hard at living, and he held hers for one steady second, and she let him. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration. But it was a beginning, unmistakable and mutual, and they both knew it. He rode back up the mountain that night. Catherine went into her surgery and stood in the dark for a while before she lit the lamp, and she thought about all the ways that this was complicated and all the ways that it was simple, and she decided that she had not come 1,500 miles from Philadelphia to let the complicated parts talk her out of the simple ones. December became January, and January was the hard cold the Rockies knew how to deliver, temperatures that dropped to places the thermometer barely registered, snow that moved in sideways on winds that had no sense of obstacle, days so white and sealed that the sky and the ground became the same thing. Catherine was busy with cold-related injuries and illness from sunup to dark most days, and Noah was largely snowbound on the mountain, but letters moved between them carried by whoever was traveling the trail, which in a pinch included Domingo, who had taken a cheerful and pragmatic attitude toward what he clearly understood was happening. The letters were extraordinary. Not in the sense of being love letters, not yet, not exactly, though they were becoming that. They were extraordinary because of what they contained, the full reach of two intelligent people who had been rationing that reach for years, suddenly finding a recipient capable of meeting them. Noah wrote about the mountain in winter, about the specific quality of silence that came with heavy snowfall, about an incident with a wounded hawk he had found in December and spent 3 weeks nursing back to health in the workshop beside his cabin. He wrote about Clara's latest letters and about the mathematics she had been studying and about a poem he had been rereading, 2 stanzas of which he copied out in his spare, clear hand, and which Catherine read and then read again. Catherine wrote about her patients, about the extraordinary complexity of treating people who mistrusted medicine while also trusting healers, about the delicate balance of establishing authority without triggering defensiveness. She wrote about Philadelphia and her father and the schoolmistress who had taught her handwriting, and she wrote about the thing she had felt when she saw him reading Whitman on that rock in November, the thing that had crashed sideways inside her chest. She wrote, "I have been asking myself since November why that image stopped me the way it stopped me. And I think the answer is that I was told so definitively what you were that finding the opposite stripped something from me that I had not known I was carrying. The expectation that I could know a person before knowing them. I had been warned, and the warning was given with such certainty, and I had let it settle in me despite my better judgment. And then you were there reading Whitman, and every assumption I had allowed to form just fell away. I think that is the moment I understood that I had been wrong, and I think that is the moment I began to understand that being wrong can be a gift." His reply came 4 days later, carried by a mining man heading back up to his claim. It said, "I have read your letter many times. When you came through the tree line, I thought you were another thing the town was sending at me. Then I looked at your face and saw that you had ridden 32 miles alone for a reason you genuinely believed in, and I thought, here is a person who has never done anything in her life just because she was expected to. I have not known many people like that. I have been one, in my own way, though mine was retreat and yours has always been advance. I think we are different shapes of the same thing." She read that and held it for a long time. February came in with more snow, and then a thaw, and then more snow again, the typical Rocky Mountain indecision of midwinter. And in the middle of February, on a day when the trail was passable for the first time in 2 weeks, Noah came down to town. He came to the surgery. He knocked. She opened the door, and he was standing there with snow in his hair from the ride down and a look on his face of a man who has made a decision. "I have something to say to you," he said. "Come in," she said, and her heart was doing the thing it did now consistently in his presence, which she had stopped trying to ignore approximately a month ago. He came in. He stood in the middle of the surgery, and he turned his hat in his hands once, the only sign of anything less than total composure, and he said, "I have been alone a long time. I chose that, and I would choose it again given what it was that broke me, because I needed the mountain the same way a broken bone needs to be set still before it can heal. But I am not broken anymore. Or I am still healing, but I know the shape I am healing into. He stopped. You are the reason I know the shape. That is what I want to say. Catherine stood very still. Her hands were clasped in front of her because if she didn't clasp them they would shake slightly, which was a physical response she found irritating and entirely understandable. "Noah," she said, "I am not asking you for an answer right now," he said. "I know that what I am, what I've been, is complicated. The mountain, Clara, the history that people in this town will tell you about. I'm not asking you to. I am in love with you," Catherine said. He stopped. The snow was melting out of his hair and the fire was crackling in the surgery's small stove, and the town of Harlan Creek was moving around them outside as if nothing extraordinary was happening, which it was not to anyone except the two people in this room. "I have been working up to saying that for 6 weeks," she said, "and it has become clear to me that I will not arrive at a better moment than this one, so." She met his eyes. "I am in love with you. I have been since approximately the 3rd letter, if you want the precise clinical data, though the onset was earlier." He crossed the room in 3 steps and he cupped her face in both hands and he kissed her, and it was not tentative and it was not practiced, and it was the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have been very patient and very careful, and are now done with patience and care for approximately this 1 minute. When they broke apart, she had her hands on his chest and his forehead was resting against hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and then she laughed again, that surprised, genuine laugh that seemed to be specific to him, and he made a sound that was low and warm and was absolutely his version of the same thing. "I have loved you since January," he said, "since the letter about the moment at the tree line." "You read that letter many times," she said, remembering. "Many times," he confirmed. Spring came to the Colorado mountains the way it always did, reluctantly and then all at once. Still snowed in passes 1 week and wildflowers pushing through the mud the next, the aspens going from bare silver to a sudden explosion of trembling green that made even practical Catherine catch her breath on the trail. She had settled something by then. She had acknowledged, internally and eventually in conversation with Noah, that she was not going back east. Harlan Creek needed her, which mattered, but that was not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was that she had built something here, a practice, a purpose, a place, and she had found, entirely unexpectedly, the person she had not known she was looking for, and she was not the kind of woman who walked away from real things in favor of familiar ones. Noah had come down to town 4 more times over the winter, and each time he had stayed longer and moved through the town with slightly less of the wariness that had been his default setting for 6 years. People had begun to calibrate their understanding of him, not without resistance, because Harlan Creek was a town of settled opinions, but with the gradual shift that happens when the evidence simply accumulates too much to ignore. Ellsworth Prout said, to Catherine's face, that he supposed Shepard was not as bad as all that. Mrs. Abernathy said with magnificent simplicity that she had known it all along. Gerald Fitch, whose arm had healed cleanly and whose water dispute with Noah had been quietly resolved over the winter through the mediation of a county surveyor Catherine had suggested, came into the surgery in March and said, with the specific awkwardness of a man not accustomed to acknowledging fault, "I may have said some things to you about Shepard last fall that were not entirely fair. I wanted you to know I am aware of that." Catherine had said, "Thank you, Mr. Fitch. The arm looks excellent." And Fitch had nodded, and that was the end of it, which was fine, because Catherine was a practical woman, and she understood that this was as close to an apology as Fitch was built to deliver, and it was enough. In April, Clara came to the mountain. Noah had arranged it with Meredith Clare, who was a sensible woman and who wanted the best for Clara, and who had understood from Noah's letters over the winter that something had changed on that mountain that warranted a visit. Clara traveled up from Pueblo with a hired companion on the stage to Harlan Creek, and Catherine met them at the stage stop because Noah had asked her to, and because She had been thinking about this meeting for 2 months, and she wanted to get it right. Clara was 10 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's, from what Noah had told her, quick, warm expressiveness, and she arrived off the stage with a carpetbag and a novel tucked under her arm and an air of assessing everything with careful intelligence that made Catherine's chest tighten with affection almost immediately. "You are Dr. Keller," Clara said. "Not a question." "I am," Catherine said. "And you are Clara Shepard, whose letters have told me more about what your father is like than he has ever told me himself." Clara considered this. Then, with the directness that was clearly a family trait, "Do you love my father?" Catherine did not flinch. "Yes," she said simply. Clara nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis. "He is different in his letters now than he was before, less careful, like he is not measuring every word before he puts it down." She tucked her novel more securely under her arm. "I think that is because of you. It seems like a good thing." "I think it is," Catherine said. "I hope so." "I need to meet him before I decide anything," Clara said. "But so far you seem all right." "That is a very fair position," Catherine said, "and I respect it entirely." They rode up to the mountain, Catherine and Clara and the hired companion, who turned around and headed back to town once Clara was safe delivered, because Clara had made it clear she did not need supervising, and Noah was waiting at the cabin, standing on the porch. And when Clara saw him, she did not run because she was 10 and considered herself past the age of running to fathers. But she walked very fast, and he came down the porch steps and caught her and held on. And Catherine stayed by the horses and gave them the minute they needed. The spring on the mountain, she thought, watching the aspens and the creek and the man she loved holding his daughter in the sharp Colorado light, was something she would not have seen if she had stayed in Philadelphia. It was one of many things she would not have seen. She was fiercely glad she had not stayed in Philadelphia. Clara spent 3 days on the mountain. She was a remarkable child. She had her father's capacity for silence and solitude. She could spend 2 hours reading without needing to be spoken to. But she was also genuinely curious and social when she chose to be. And she had questions about medicine that Catherine answered with full seriousness, which Clara clearly appreciated. On the second evening, when Noah had gone to check the horse and Clara and Catherine were sitting on the porch watching the last light leave the peaks, Clara said, with her characteristic directness, "Do you think you will stay in Harlan Creek?" "Yes," Catherine said. "Will you and my father?" She paused, working out how to phrase it. "Are you going to make a life together?" Catherine looked at her steadily. "I believe we are, but I would want very much for that to be something you are comfortable with." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My mother died when I was 4, she said. "I don't really remember her. I remember the shape of her, the feeling of her, not the details." A pause. "Papa never, I always thought he might never let himself have someone again, because I think it would have felt like a betrayal to her. But I also think," she stopped again, gathered herself, "I think she would have wanted him not to be alone on a mountain for the rest of his life. And I think you are not trying to replace her. You are a different thing entirely." "That is exactly right," Catherine said softly. "Then I am comfortable with it," Clara said, with the air of someone who has completed a careful calculation and arrived at a satisfying result. "Quite comfortable, actually." Noah proposed to Catherine on a Tuesday in May, on the flat granite boulder by the creek where she had first found him reading. He had clearly thought about this for some time, because the words were his own, and they were not borrowed from any poem, which she understood was significant for a man who loved poetry, that he had not reached for anyone else's language for this. He told her that he had been lost and that he had believed, for a long time, that being lost was simply what he now was. He told her that she had ridden up his mountain without warning and without fear, and had given him the most direct, honest attention anyone had given him in years, and that this had undone something in him that he had not known could be undone. He told her that he wanted to build something with her, not up here only, and not down in the town only, but something that moved between them, that had room for her work and for his land and for Clara, and for whatever else came. And then he reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring that he had clearly made in Pueblo on his last visit. A simple gold band with a small inset stone that was the dark blue-gray color of his eyes on a clear day, and he asked her to marry him. Catherine, who had maintained composure through difficult surgeries and professional slights, and a 2-day blizzard in January in which she had treated 4 frostbite cases and not slept, found that she had entirely lost it now, which surprised her and did not surprise her at all. "Yes," she said, and her voice was completely clear even though her eyes were not. "Noah, yes, of course yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, completely open, every wall down, the full weight of his feeling visible and unguarded, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone who has been protecting themselves for a long time finally stops. She kissed him, there on the boulder by the creek, with the water running cold and clear over the stones below them, and the mountains enormous and indifferent around them, and the spring sky enormous and blue above. And it was the kind of kiss that you remember precisely and completely for the rest of your life. They were married in June in the Baptist church, which was the one whose preacher had been slightly less startled by the match. It was a small ceremony. Catherine had no family present from the East, which she felt more than she had expected to, though she wrote to her mother's sister in Philadelphia, who sent a letter of warm congratulation and a bolt of fine ivory fabric that arrived barely in time. Noah had no family in Harlan Creek either, though Clara came up from Pueblo with Meredith Clare, who turned out to be a small, upright woman with sharp eyes who looked at Noah and Catherine together, and nodded once with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular outcome longer than anyone knew. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front row and wept cheerfully throughout the ceremony. Domingo, freshly suited in his one good jacket, stood at the back with an expression of profound satisfaction. Even Ellsworth Prout, who attended with his wife and his mendied son Eli, appeared to experience a genuine feeling of some kind, though he kept it well buttoned. Gerald Fitch did not attend, but he sent a practical and somewhat touching wedding gift of 2 good horses, which Catherine accepted as the gesture of reconciliation it clearly was. The reception was held in the hotel dining room and lasted 4 hours, and at some point during those 4 hours, Clara took Catherine's hand and leaned against her shoulder in a way that was, on Clara's part, clearly voluntary and deliberate, and Catherine put her arm around the girl and held her gently. And Noah, who was watching from across the room, saw this and had to look away for a moment because he was not a man who cried in public, but he was apparently willing to consider it. They built their life with the same deliberate, honest care that had built their love. Catherine continued her practice in Harlan Creek, which continued to grow. Noah came down to town regularly, not daily, not even weekly in the deepest winter, but consistently, in a pattern that became as known and reliable as the seasons themselves. People stopped being startled by his presence. Mrs. Abernathy's bronchitis eventually improved to the point where she could make the walk to the surgery herself, and on several of those walks, she stopped at the general store and shared detailed reports of Catherine's excellent care and competent character with whoever happened to be present, which contributed materially to Catherine's practice in ways that no advertisement could have matched. The surgery expanded in the autumn of that first year. A second room added with timber from Noah's land, cut and shaped by Noah himself with assistance from Domingo, and a rancher named Torres who had developed a genuine friendship with Noah over a shared interest in weather patterns and their effect on livestock. The expansion allowed Catherine to keep patients overnight when necessary, which she had needed to do several times with inadequate space, and it made the surgery one of the better-equipped small medical facilities in that part of Colorado, which Catherine had every intention of improving further as supplies and time permitted. Clara came to the mountain every summer for a month, and to Harlan Creek for 2 weeks at Christmas, and in between she and Catherine maintained a correspondence that deepened over the years into one of the realest friendships of both their lives. Clara was, as she had appeared from the beginning, a young woman of exceptional intelligence and directness, and she was also, more importantly, a person who had her father's depth and her father's capacity for loyalty, and she gave both of those things to Catherine with a completeness that never ceased to move her. In the spring of their second year, Catherine found herself looking at evidence that she was with child, and the evidence was unambiguous, and she sat in the surgery with the door locked for 15 minutes processing this information with the particular mixture of joy and vertigo that she imagined was universal to this discovery, regardless of how medically informed one happened to be. She told Noah that evening. He was at the cabin's table reading when she came in. He was always reading when she came in. This was one of the great reliable constants of her life now, and she loved it with an intimacy that surprised her regularly. And she sat down across from him and said, with characteristic directness, "I am pregnant." He put the book down. He looked at her with those dark gray eyes that she knew now in every shade of their weather: storm still, storm close, storm clearing, full sun, and this was full sun. "How are you?" he said, and the question was asking more than the words. "I am excellent," she said, and she meant it, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm a doctor. I know what to expect. I'm healthy and young enough," and her voice caught slightly on something she hadn't planned. "I am so happy, Noah. I need you to know that." He came around the table and he sat beside her and he put his arms around her, and she leaned against him the way she had learned to lean, not because she needed the support. She was a woman who stood very well on her own, but because there was a particular joy available in leaning against someone who was entirely solid and entirely present and entirely yours, and she had earned the right to that joy. "I am happy too," he said quietly into her hair. "More than I know how to say. Which for me is considerable." "I know," she said. "I know." Their son was born in November in the surgery in Harlan Creek, delivered by Catherine herself with Noah present and assisting, which had raised some eyebrows when she announced this plan, but which she proceeded with regardless, because she was a trained physician and this was her area of expertise, and she would not be told otherwise. The birth was without complication. The boy came into the world at 7 in the morning when the sky was just going gray, and he was healthy and loud, and had Noah's dark hair, and what would eventually prove to be Catherine's eyes. They named him James after Catherine's father, and they named him William for the middle name, after no one in particular except that it seemed to fit him. Clara, when she met James at Christmas, held him with the careful expertise of someone who had spent time around the children of Meredith Clare's neighbors, and she looked down at his small face with an expression that was wonder and something else, something older and quieter. "He looks like Papa," she said. "He does," Catherine agreed. "He also makes the exact same face Noah makes when he's about to disagree with something, but hasn't decided how to phrase it yet." Clara laughed, a real bright laugh, and Noah, who was standing by the fireplace pretending not to listen, shook his head slowly. "That is not a face I make," he said. "It is absolutely a face you make," Catherine and Clara said simultaneously, and then looked at each other and laughed again, and James, disturbed by the noise, made a small disgruntled sound that was absolutely the face in question. The years did what years do, they stacked themselves up into a life. Harlan Creek grew. The railroad came to the valley below, not through the town itself, but close enough that the town changed anyway, new people arriving, new commerce, a second general store that gave Prout some needed competition and improved his prices considerably. Catherine's practice evolved with the town. She hired a trained nurse in the third year, a capable young woman from Ohio named Miss Hartley who had come west looking for work, and who turned out to be exactly what the expanded surgery needed. She fought several battles with county administrators about the dispensary budget, and she won most of them, and the ones she lost she found ways around. She wrote papers. She corresponded with colleagues at the Woman's Medical College, and with a growing number of physicians in the West who were encountering the same challenges she was. She contributed to a medical journal out of Denver, first as a correspondent and later as a regular voice on frontier medicine and the specific challenges of women's health in isolated communities, a topic she had opinions about in considerable depth and was not shy about sharing. Noah came down to town with increasing ease over the years, though the mountain remained his truest ground. He took on some of the timber contracts that the coming railroad had made newly viable, which gave him income and a reason to interact with the growing network of men building in the valley. And he did this work well and honestly, and with the particular quality of competence that made people who had initially been uncertain about him revise their assessments quickly. The water dispute with Fitch resolved permanently via a formal agreement that was, in Catherine's private opinion, entirely favorable to Noah, and was a result of the fact that Gerald Fitch had eventually understood that he was in the wrong, and that Catherine Keller Shepard was not a woman who would let her husband be cheated out of something that was rightfully his. The dark past that people had whispered about the isolation, the rifle at the property line, the years of retreat became, over time, simply part of the story of who Noah Shepard was and how he had arrived at who he was now. Not forgotten, not erased, but contextualized. He had been hurt. He had needed time. He had built himself back, alone and then, with more speed and solidity than he could have managed alone with Catherine. This was not a shameful story. It was a human one. In the late summer of their 5th year together, when James was 3 and just beginning to be his full, vocal, opinionated self, and when Clara was 15 and spending her longest visit yet on the mountain before starting at a school in Denver in the fall, something happened on the mountain that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. It was an evening in August, cool and perfect, the sky that specific altitude blue that she still caught her breath at after 5 years. She had come up to the cabin on a Friday as she always did when she could manage it, and after supper Clara and James had both fallen asleep, James in the trundle bed in the corner and Clara in the loft, and Catherine and Noah were sitting on the porch in the 2 handmade chairs watching the stars come out. He was reading again, or had been. The book was on the railing and he had set it down. She was not doing anything except looking at the mountains and being warm in her coat and listening to the creek below. "Do you remember what you were reading?" she said. "The first day I came here." "Whitman," he said. "A song of myself." A pause. "You came through the trees and the first thing I thought was that you were like the passage I had just been reading, about the person who walks toward you without pretense." Catherine turned to look at him. "You never told me that." "I wasn't sure how to tell you without it sounding," he considered, "excessive." "It doesn't sound excessive," she said. "It sounds exactly right." She looked back at the stars. "I was so frightened that day. I had been told such specific things about you, and then every single one of them was wrong, and I did not know what to do with that. You seemed entirely composed. I was terrified. I have a very good composed face. It is a professional necessity." He made the sound that was his laugh low and warm and rare enough that she still valued it every time. "I know your composed face," he said. "I also know what's behind it now." "You do," she agreed. She reached across the space between the chairs and found his hand in the dark, the way she always found it, easily, without looking, as if her hand knew where his was by orientation, the way a compass finds north. He held it. The stars came out in their thousands over the Colorado Rockies, and the creek ran over its stones below, and the cabin behind them held their sleeping children, and the mountains stood as they had always stood, enormous and indifferent to human complexity, but somehow also, in this particular moment, like a frame around something that deserved one. "I'm glad you came up the mountain," Noah said, quietly, the way he said all the things that mattered most. "I'm glad I came up the mountain," Catherine said. "I would do it again. I know you would." A pause. "That's one of the reasons." "One of the reasons what?" "One of the reasons I love you." He said it easily now, the way you say something when you have said it enough times that it no longer requires courage, just truth. The list is long, but that is near the top. Catherine laughed softly. You have a list. I'm a methodical person. You are, she agreed. She turned her head against the chair back to look at him in the faint starlight. At the profile she knew as well as her own hands by now, the jaw, the eyes, the set of his shoulders in their habitual slight angle of a man who has learned to take up just the space he needs and no more. Tell me the top of the list. He considered. You came up the mountain alone when everyone told you not to, he said. You treated me like a person when you had no reason to expect I would return the courtesy. You told me you were in love with me in the middle of my sentence when you could clearly see I was going to talk around it for another 10 minutes. He paused, and you read Hardy. That last one is a little less significant than the others. It is significant, he said, entirely seriously. It tells you a great deal about a person. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Somewhere below them in the dark, the creek ran on, and the mountain stood still, and the stars above Harlan Creek, Colorado, in the year 1884, were extraordinary in the way they always were at altitude, huge and clear, and so numerous that the sky looked as if someone had been lavish with a salt shaker on black velvet, indiscriminate and gorgeous, the way real things tend to be. Clara finished school in Denver 3 years later and came back to Colorado to study medicine, having been inspired by Catherine to the profession in a way that Catherine found both deeply moving and entirely logical. She was a young woman of formidable intelligence and the kind of focused determination that the medical profession absolutely required, and she wrote to Catherine regularly throughout her studies, and Catherine answered every letter with the full engagement and detailed attention of a mentor who was also, by this point, something she would not have anticipated in the November of 1879, when Clara had been an unknown child in a letter, and the mountain had been an obstacle between her and a feral man she had been warned about. She was family, fully and in every sense. In the winter of their 8th year together, Catherine found she was pregnant again, and this time the knowledge arrived with less vertigo and more pure, settled joy. The joy of a woman who knows exactly where she is and who she is with and what she is building. She told Noah in the same way she had told him the first time, directly, sitting across from him at the table while he was reading, and he responded in the same way he always responded to things of importance, which was to put down what he was doing and be completely present. James will be delighted, he said. He has been asking for a sibling for 2 years. He has, Catherine agreed. James at 6 was a force of personality who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's observational intelligence in a combination that was frequently charming and occasionally exhausting. What do you hope for? Noah asked. Healthy, Catherine said immediately. That is always first. She paused. But if pressed, I would not mind a daughter. Their daughter was born in September, which was the most beautiful month on the Colorado mountain, when the aspens went gold, and the air had that crystalline quality of the first real edge of autumn. She was born healthy and loud, and with her mother's dark hair and her father's dark gray eyes, and she was placed in Catherine's arms while Noah stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder, and looked at his daughter with the expression Catherine had been watching across the years become more and more natural on his face. The open, unguarded, fully present expression of a man who had learned, by degrees and by love and by time and by the stubborn, patient, brilliant woman who had ridden up his mountain without an invitation, to trust his own happiness. They named her Anna, which was Noah's idea, quiet and gentle, and offered with the understanding that the name was an honoring rather than a haunting. Catherine had accepted it with the fullness of a woman who understood the difference. James took his naming duties as older sibling very seriously from the first day, positioning himself beside the cradle with a protective gravity that was remarkably similar to his father's quality of stillness, and pronouncing after a thorough examination that Anna was acceptable and would probably improve. Clara, who visited that Christmas, held Anna for an hour while James explained to her in detail all the important things she had missed by not arriving sooner, and looked up at some point at Catherine and Noah standing together by the fire and said, with the clean simplicity she had always had, "You are both very happy." "We are," Noah said. "Good," said Clara. "You both earned it." Catherine looked at Noah over the warmth of the firelight and the noise of their children and the particular quality of the winter silence beyond the cabin walls, and she thought of a cold November morning and a flat granite boulder beside a mountain creek and a book of Whitman poetry falling from a man's hands when she came through the trees, and she thought of all the things she had been told before that moment and all the things she had found instead. She had been told the mountain man was uncivilized, dangerous, lost. She had been told to stay away, to keep her distance, to trust the warnings of people who knew better. She had found a man reading poetry alone, which was not the wild savage they had described. It was, she understood now in the fullness of all that had followed, the most human thing in the world, a person who had been hurt and had retreated into beauty, who had built himself a life from the materials of solitude and language and mountain silence, and who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone who would come up the trail without fear and sit at his table and meet him honestly. She had been that person. She was still that person. She would always be glad that she was. Noah caught her looking and raised an eyebrow in the slight, contained way that she had spent years learning to read and now read as easily as any text. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about the boulder," she said. He understood immediately, because after 8 years and 2 children and more letters than either of them had counted, they had the shorthand of people who have built something large enough and solid enough that the parts do not always need explaining. He smiled. It was not a small smile. On Noah Shepard's face, even the contained smiles were enormous in what they held, and this one held everything. The November morning and the creek and the cabin and the letters and the surgery in Harlan Creek and the wedding and the children and Clara and all the years of quiet, real, earned happiness that had built up between them like snow in a good winter, deep and clean and covering everything in white. "Good memory," he said. "The best I have," she said. Anna made a small sound in Clara's arms, and James immediately came over to investigate, and the cabin was full of voices and warmth and the smell of pine fire, and outside the Colorado winter was doing what it always did, being enormous and cold and indifferent and magnificent, and inside the lamp was lit, and the books were on the shelf, and the ring on Catherine's finger was the dark gray blue of her husband's eyes on a clear day, and every single thing she had come west for, and several things she had not known she was coming for, were here, now, present, and entirely hers. She put her hand in Noah's as he came to stand beside her, and he held it with the easy, complete certainty of a man who had learned that the things worth holding deserve to be held without hesitation. And they stood together watching their family and their fire, and the story of the mountain, and the doctor, and the poetry, and the love that had been built from honest words and cold mornings, and a willingness to ride 32 miles into the unknown, and see what was actually there. That story settled around them like the best kind of ending, not the end of anything, the deep, breathing middle of everything.